Do you have concerns about how much time you spend on a computer, whether it's desktop or a laptop or on a tablet or on your smartphone or even watching television? Over the past year, a lot of people would probably agree they've been spending more time than ever using screens and technology linked to screens. You might be online for work, you might be having meetings online, working from home, you might be using streaming services to watch box sets and to keep the kids entertained. What impact, though, does the increased use of technology, and particularly sit in front of screens, have on us? Dr. David Ellis is an Associate Professor in Information Systems at the University of Bath. David, thank you for joining us.
Hello.
On BBC Radio Shropshire this morning. Is there such a thing? Is it possible to say that someone is spending too much time on screens or on a screen, or is that just too crude a measure?
It's such a difficult one because there's so many, as you say, there's so many different ways people can use a screen, and it's for so many different purposes as well. So it's really difficult to put a single number on it, because it's going to depend what people are doing, right? I mean, I could be out running and using my Apple Watch, and that might be viewed as more healthy than watching TV. But there's not an awful lot of research out there that's really measured the amount of time people are using a screen, directly. It tends to be based on an estimate or a survey, for example.
Right, and our devices tell us how long. Well, give us a rough idea of how long we've been using them for. But I'm never sure exactly how those are calculated, or whether it knows we've actually been looking at the screen at the time it thinks we are.
Yeah, that's right. I guess what you're raising there is that difference between like active use and passive use, because there's a big difference between me talking to my friend versus mindlessly browsing Facebook. And that's really the challenge of understanding the effects of screens, is that there's so many different things you can do, and you could be reading a book versus playing a video game, and those are very different activities. People will have different views on whether one of those is worse than the other. Yeah.
What effects might there be, just on a physiological point of view? I've heard quite a few people anecdotally saying they feel their eyesight's got worse since lockdown, since they've been spending more time either close up to computers, close up to screens of one kind or another.
Yes, I think the evidence for the physiological things is much more convincing. So, I mean, obviously, one of the challenges we have is people engaging with too much sedentary behaviour. And if you're sitting in front of a screen, by and large, you're sitting still. And the other thing is people potentially using their phones or things and then falling over when they're walking, or being distracted when they're driving. These are genuine issues. Although it is interesting that technology companies, I think it's either, I can't remember which one, but there's reminders now pop up on a screen, or it's soon to be when if you're walking, it will say "Watch out, you're walking and using your phone," sort of thing.
Oh right, that's
yeah. I think that's coming. So there's going to be a reminder where if the phone detects that you're walking and you're looking at the screen, it'll say "Watch out."
And that's the physiological effects. What about what the effect it might have? It has or might have on our brains, or the way we use them, or the way they work.
So that's really challenging. And I think what we've found with a lot of technologies is that early research suggests, screen time is, linked to depression or linked to anxiety. But as soon as kind of slightly better research designs come in, better measures, those effects tend to disappear. So, I mean, anyone who's claiming that there's this really strong causal link between technology use and mood or depression, it's really just not established. If whatever's going on is far more nuanced. So the evidence base there is, there's a lot of really good science out there. There's an awful lot of very poor quality stuff as well.
And what about the science of the amount of time that children and young people spend on screens? It seems to be something that some people are very keen to whip up a moral panic about, but I was wondering whether that's supported by the evidence.
Yes, I mean, I think people should be mindful, of course, of how children are spending their time. Although it's worth noting that a lot of education would have basically stopped during COVID if it wasn't for technology that we have available to us.
Yeah.
I mean, again, there's this history of moral panics around technology. So if you go back to not that far back, but video games, social media, the internet, smartphones. We kind of have a tendency it's a challenge because people develop these new technologies before we really understand what the effects are going to be. but it's often this view that they're inherently bad, and then we learn that actually, well, there are real harms, but they're not the things that we initially thought. So what I'm saying is you've got things like screen time, but that really hides genuine digital harms like misinformation or disinformation or a lack of access to technology, which societally is a much bigger issue because there's many people who, if they don't have access to broadband, they are kind of cut off from lots of other services. So you could almost turn the argument around in its head and say, actually, it's a lack of access that's a bigger problem than too much.
So we should be more concerned about people who aren't able to use screens because then they're kind of digitally excluded than people who might be possibly spending what other people might regard as too long doing it.
Absolutely. I mean, I think if you were making policy or you were thinking about where the real harm is, I think there's a danger that the sort of moral panic of screen time, which is so general it could mean anything, disguises genuine problems that we could do something about as a society. So that lack of access problem is demonstratively, a harm versus something that's like, well, you're on a screen, that must be bad, sort of thing. There's a lot more to unpack around that screen time area, if you like.
You mentioned online learning earlier on. To what extent do you think the pandemic has changed our relationship with technology?
Well, I mean, I suppose it's caused us to think more deeply about it, but also, I mean, as somebody who teaches at a university as well, it has totally changed the way we've had to deliver material, and it's had positive as well as perhaps negative impacts. I mean, so this is purely anecdotally for myself, but normally if I'm teaching, a room full of 200 students, they're quite nervous about asking questions. Despite me trying to be very approachable and everything. But when you're online, they're quite happy to just type questions in a chat room. And that's been really, for me anyway, that's been really useful because I get to know what they're struggling with, what they find more difficult, and I think it's improved some of the content. So I suspect that's been true of other places as well. But then I do miss, and I'm sure they miss being in a lecture theatre, doing it the way we used to.
David, thank you very much for joining us this morning. It's been really interesting talking to you. Dr. David Ellis, Associate Professor in Information Systems at the University of Bath. We're going to be talking more about this a little later on this morning on the show. If you've got something to say about this, about screen time, whether you're concerned about your screen time or whether it's screen time that makes a positive difference to your life, 0808 100 96 96 or email me using screen, jim.hawkins@bbc.co.uk.